one colleague in particular who was a very left-wing Labour voting person, he said, "I'm finding Priti Patel a bit attractive." And he was really stressed out with this. Whereas I thought, how could you find Priti Patel attractive given the views? Let's look at the difference between what we want and what we like. So we find someone, we think of them as credible, and we're so glad we met them and we're swept away and we don't know why. But there's something weird about the idea that we sit down to design what we think we want. And maybe what we think we want doesn't work out, because it's very unlike one of those encounters where you're suddenly swept up. So is there a kind of, I mean, Zoe just said it, that people are being a bit more exploratory on Tinder, but maybe that's because of the disappointment that when they specify what they want and they try it out, it doesn't really work. Mm-hmm. So should we be more adventurous on dating apps? Should we sort of dissolve some of those filters? Should we think of ourselves as, having to avoid just specifying what we desire because it might not be what we actually like?
I think there are two things. So one is, I wouldn't limit it to dating apps. I think that people should, which I'm actually interested in what you think about this, because I'm not sure what you think about this, but I think people, if they can, I'm not saying force yourself to fancy people. I personally would be horrified to hear that someone who was, trialing being more ethical and open had given me a go. So please don't do that.
Yeah, go on, have a spin.
Yeah, give me a whirl, see how that goes. Right. Aside from that, I just think shutting yourself off from opportunities, we're all so shaped by these ideas of what it is that we think that we want from our lives. I know I have been, and I've been trying to push against that in lots of areas of my life, and whether that's you need to be married by a certain age, whether I want to have children or not, all now, have a big question mark over them. So I do think both on apps and in real life, kind of pushing against what you think you want to give space to the potential that actually you could meet someone that you wouldn't have imagined, who you might desire or might be a better fit for you than anything you could have thought of, is a good thing. That said, I would say that we do live in a structurally racist society. So 44% of people surveyed, this is the second survey of this kind. The first one was an ATSEN, which is a pretty solid survey. 44% of people surveyed think that some races are just born harder working than others. If you believe that, I don't want to date you. But that's 44% is quite a high percentage. And so I do think if someone has had lots of negative experiences and they are marginalized and decides that they're using an app and saying, my preference is a person of the same ethnicity and it's a deal breaker because I don't want to go through that again, that's a completely legitimate response to trying to prevent harm after experiencing harm over and over again. That's obviously very different from a white supremacist just being like, I don't want to date another ethnicity. So I think it's not always as easy as just being more open, because our society isn't the way that I hope it will one day be, and people are trying to maneuver within the realities of that.
So I'm also interested in whether, this is called the politics of desire, but the desires fitting to politics. Maybe the attitudes of the people matter as much. I mean, you could look at them, you could think they look fine, you could find yourself physically attracted to them, but there's some sense in which, when you know some of their politics, you just think no. I mean, it's like it's a filter.
Oh yeah.
Right. So if that can happen, there is at least room for something, as it were, outside the mere biological. I've had colleagues who one colleague in particular, who was a very left-wing Labour voting person, he said, "I'm finding Priti Patel a bit attractive." And he was really stressed out with this. Whereas I thought, how could you find Priti Patel attractive given the views? I mean, it was just, so maybe we're getting obsessed on dating apps with looking at physical characteristics, and those are not actually the things that are always going to be most important when you meet the person. So should the apps actually have more information?
So you can put it on there.
Yeah.
So I
Do you?
Oh yeah, and I also leave clues of my politics. So I had one. You can have like a prompt on Hinge. I don't actually use dating apps because I find life admin boring, but I appreciate other people have found love this way. But you can put a prompt, and so I put one that said like, oh, what would you do if you could go back in time? And I said, stop Columbus setting sail. And that just kind of lets people know I'm not into colonialism and slavery. But you've got to let the people know. But you can also put your like political affiliations and your beliefs on there. I've seen a lot of like people photos with like something overtly political to let you know who they are. So you can do that.
I think this is the thing we should be worrying about. If
Tell
we're
me.
worrying about people picking people like them, and we're worrying about that solely in the domain of skin color and height, why aren't we worrying about ideological homogeneity and the reproduction of bubbles, which we know now has created an incredibly divisive society? So why aren't we equally worrying about the fact that people say, never, if you're a Tory, get lost. If you're a Remainer, get lost. If you're a Brexiter, get lost. Maybe we should be equally kind of like, no, it would be really good for. I mean, I personally have always dated people who have the opposite politics to me, and it's extremely stressful. But it is way more interesting, and
In an exciting sort of way.
Well, it keeps me from being completely smug and unaware about my own politics because I'm constantly coming up against boyfriends and, frankly, friends from being an academic who, it sort of checks me, I suppose. But so yeah.
No, I was just going to say, being on the apps, I've come across, quite a lot of conspiracy theorists that would be on the far left, and then more, Andrew Tate fans, and it's a minefield out there. But I think that, it's crazy. But I think, and then I get a lot of, people who are very suspicious and kind of, not very keen on me when I say I'm a journalist. So I think, to return back to, sexual desire, I do definitely agree with Kimberly, and I was going to say it, but I just forgot to read my note. I do think that in the context of choosing as a person of colour, if you just want to date people of colour as a protection mechanism and to, protect yourself against racism, I think that would be, one situation where that kind of modification is okay. But in terms of the algorithms are just invented to mimic society. So given we live in a structurally racist society, the algorithm and the AI is just going to reflect that. I think to kind of move away, to a slightly different point, I do think on a positive note, we are getting more open in terms of like people being way more likely to share, one of the apps I'm on, people share so much about their sexual preferences, and there's so many people on there who are in a relationship, they're looking for another partner to join them. That's called a unicorn, in case you didn't know. And I think that actually a lot more people are taking a more experimental, exploratory view to matters of love and sex. So I think in some ways we're really going in the right direction, and it's like, it's probably never been as socially acceptable as it is now to have a threesome. It's true.
It's true. Yeah. You've been on field.
I might just be yanking us a little bit into another terrain. But actually, I was having a conversation earlier with my mother, who's in the crowd, and she made a really interesting point, which is that consent is if we're looking at the history or present of desire, it's worth thinking about the history and present of consent. And if we think of desire as this natural thing to go across the room and grab. Well, that's actually not okay now, even though it happens, and Me Too, and we know all about that. So I think there's a sort of as society has evolved in the last 50, 70 years, there's been a curtailment of what the scope of desire can be. So you can't rampage around taking what you want. And this is the problem of, whereas that's absolutely certainly what men just absolutely did, much more, and depending on where they were. But this is the problem, a fundamental problem, again, of dating apps, is that people confuse different kind of domains of want and desire. So people, I did a MPhil thesis all about the degree to which you could actually think of dating as like a commodified, online dating as a commodified arena. And actually, it's pretty obvious that breaks down really quickly, because you cannot get what you want. The problem of reciprocity is enormous, and dating apps obviously you can't just take what you want. It has to be reflected back at you. So I don't know, I suppose I just throw that in to complicate the idea that there's some sort of, we all know what desire means, that it's always meant the same thing. The literal limits on what desire can mean, I think, have really changed, and they need to change more. And Me Too was this kind of real moment of reckoning about, getting a grip, the not about who you choose, but how you do it, kind of thing. And I think that's important.
For podcasts, talks, debates, courses and articles, visit the Institute of Art and Ideas. Click the link on screen now to iai.tv.